team which drafted the 3 gender-based violence the acts, and I'm also part of the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide National Strategic Plan Pillar 3. So this team is essentially put together to ensure that the deliverables in terms of Pillar 3 of the NSP, which includes the GBV Acts, are given action to. And the first 2 pieces of legislation commenced on the 27th of July and the 5th of August this year. And the commencement of the amendments to the Domestic Violence Act are still pending. So I'm going to be your moderator for today, and just to ensure that we all engage and receive the best value of our time together, it's important just to do a bit of housekeeping. So with regards to time, we'll be together until 3:30, and the webinar will comprise a presentation section and a section for you to engage with the presenter. So please keep your videos off and your microphones muted until we reach the discussion section, whereupon you'll be invited to post a question or to engage with the presenter. Please use the chat box for your questions and comments, and please also type your name and email in the chat box if you'd like the presentation distributed to you. Mr. DeQueni of the Department of Justice is on the platform, and he's ready to take your details. All the presentations and material will be made available online and placed on YouTube for you to access at a later date. I've just been asked to notify you that the webinar on vetting of employees and the National Register for Sexual Offenders will not take place tomorrow, and it will be postponed till further notice. You will be notified as soon as that does come about. So this brings us to the topic for today, and that is the social context in domestic violence. Without factoring in social context, legislation will remain a blunt and ineffective tool. So to ensure a clear pathway of services, understanding the social context in which domestic violence occurs is integral to interrupting violence. I have the pleasure of introducing Karen Reese, who will be our presenter today. She is currently the Advocacy Consultant for Mosaic Training, Service and Healing Center, which aims to prevent and reduce abuse and domestic violence by providing holistic, integrated services for the healing and empowerment of women through support services, access to justice and training. Now, Karen is a registered social worker and holds a master's degree in social policy and management from UCT. And she's been in the gender-based violence space for just over a decade and has been actively involved in commenting on the 3 gender-based violence acts. Karen promotes a meaningful, multi-sectoral, collaborative approach at a local, regional, and global level with the view to eradicating gender-based violence. Thank you, Karen. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Well, thank you so much, Deline, and it's fantastic to be with all of you this afternoon. If you're in Cape Town, I really hope that you are keeping warm and dry. It is a miserable day out there. And in the rest of the country, hope that you are keeping safe. And yeah, it's just fantastic to have you all join. I see that the number of people have grown a little bit, so hopefully others that were struggling to get on the platform are now able to join us. So let me get my presentation up for you. If you could just confirm that you see a purple and white screen in front of you.
Perfect, Karen.
Great, thank you. Right, well, Deline, thank you so much for that introduction and also for introducing the presentation for today. And just as you said, if we don't understand the dynamics and the social context of domestic violence, not only can we not interrupt the violence, but it also, as a first responder, and if we look at the system that is set up to respond to domestic violence, it's very unlikely that that system will be effective and efficient if it doesn't take into account the dynamics and social context. So really today, I'm wanting to unpack a little bit about what those dynamics of domestic violence are, and then what is the social context that this domestic violence thrives in as we see it becoming more and more entrenched in our country. So just before I get going, just for those that don't know about Mosaic, Mosaic is a community-based nonprofit organization, and we are based primarily in the Western Cape, but we also have footprints in Gauteng as well as in KwaZulu-Natal. And the vision of the organization is to end violence against women in all its forms in our society. And we do this in a very holistic way. We holistically work to prevent and respond to domestic violence by providing services that empower women to claim their rights. And now some of these services are quite direct services in providing service to assist women to access justice. And this we do through our court support service program within magistrates' courts, where we assist victims of domestic violence to apply for protection orders and provide psychosocial care and referrals. And we also work within Thuthuzela care centers in partnership with the National Prosecuting Authority. We provide longer-term counseling and referral through our support and healing pillar. And then we also believe that to truly complete the healing process, there needs to be a skills development and empowerment component, and that we do through our empowerment pillar. Finally, when we talk about preventing violence, we need to take into account that violence happens at a societal level. So we need to take a whole society approach in order to working with it. And if we do that, we then need to engage men and boys around changing the way that, or transforming harmful gender norms into norms that no longer promote and accept violence. And finally, the work that underpins all the work that Mosaic does is around advocacy and policy work. So we take learnings from what we do and we apply that to the evidence that we provide to change and reform law and policy. So that's a little bit about the organization. At the end of the presentation, the website will be available there if you do want to go have a look at a little bit more about what Mosaic does. But let's jump straight into the presentation for today. So as I said, we need to understand the dynamics of domestic violence. Now, I want to propose that domestic and intimate partner violence is unlike any other form of violence. The United Nations Children's Fund put together this quote that says, "The family is often equated to a sanctuary, a place where individuals seek love, safety, security, and shelter. But the evidence shows that it is also a place that imperils lives and breeds some of the most drastic forms of violence perpetrated against women and girls." Now, just taking this into consideration, it paints a picture of what this violence is that is being brought forward, or what is being experienced by women and children, and is being brought into the criminal justice system as the system to respond. It's violence that is happening in a space that is private. It's happening in a space where we're supposed to feel loved and cared for and safe. And on a side note, it's often this very private nature of this violence that to a certain degree actually makes this violence acceptable. But we'll explore a little bit more about that later on. So what is the reality? I think if you've joined this webinar, the chances are you are already working within the context of gender-based violence. So I don't need to go on too much about what the reality is in the country when we're talking about gender-based violence. But it's no secret that gender-based violence is fearfully becoming quite deeply entrenched in the fabric of South Africa. So much so that no one organization or entity can address it alone. We are seeing unprecedented levels of violence within our homes. In just the last quarter, the crime stats presented by the Minister of Police, we saw that domestic-related crimes, so these are crimes that happen within the home of either the perpetrator or the victim, we saw that just under half of serious assault cases happened within a home environment. Almost a third of attempted murders and murders happened within the home, and 2/3 of instances of rape took place within the home environment. So thinking back to, if we're thinking about homes as the safe space, and yet half, if not more, of serious violence cases are happening within the home. Now, in addition to that, we're seeing that we need a multi-sectoral systemic approach to responding to this violence. And we need attitudinal and behavioral change. So we can see that change needs to happen on a number of levels for us to intersect this violence or stop this violence. But considering this, we still see this massive disconnect between national policy, provincial plans, and what is actually happening at a local implementation level. We have a criminal justice system that is completely overwhelmed, that has multiple vacancies, but is still needing to assist a growing number of complainants. And we see a limited number of places of safety for survivors and their children. Now, when we're looking at the disconnect, we see this disconnect not only at a policy level, but we're even seeing a disconnect in who is included in what plans. And if we talk about programs for violence against women, it hardly ever includes violence against children, and vice versa. When we're working on programs that focus on violence against children, there very rarely do you see an intersection between the violence that's happening in the home with women and the violence happening with children. So we need to start bringing all these approaches together. So that's the reality. That's what we're looking at. So when we know that in a country we have large numbers of gender-based violence occurring, but more so, our homes are becoming increasingly violent. Now, during 2020 and 2021, Mosaic, together with the UCT Gender Health and Justice Research Unit, conducted a baseline study. Now, this was done to inform Mosaic programming towards strengthening the collective response to domestic violence, as well as to inform the legislative reform that we've just gone through. Now, this research had the central objective to explore the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act as through the perceptions of criminal justice officials. Now, while the purpose of the session is not to present the findings of this research, it is useful to look at some of the perceptions gathered, which indicate the importance of understanding the dynamics and social context of domestic violence. So some of these findings, we found inconsistencies in the interpretation and the implementation of the law at a local level. But we also found inconsistencies in the implementation of the regulations. Now, I just want to note this isn't always a negative thing. We did find some courts and police stations that had developed their own informal systems to aid in increased access to justice, taking into account the very local nuances of the community served. The biggest inconsistencies we saw were in the training provided. And I want to talk here specifically to how this training was perceived and how this training was perceived by magistrates, clerks of the court, as well as police working with domestic violence matters. Participants who had received official department-led training shared that their general perception was that the training adequately prepared them to follow administrative and procedural processes. However, participants felt that training did not adequately address the complexities and dynamics of domestic violence and how to engage with victims of domestic violence at the time of reporting or responding to an incident, or when the complainant presents themselves at court to apply for a protection order. Now, from this, it is quite clear that there is a need for understanding the domestic violence dynamics and social context. And this is purely from the perceptions provided by the criminal justice officials. But in addition to this, there is a huge amount of frustration that has been shared by criminal justice officials on the front line, but even those that are in more senior positions, at the large number of withdrawals of cases, either at a court level or at a police station level. And again, this comes down to what are the dynamics that lead to the complainant coming to withdraw a matter or to apply for a matter to be withdrawn. So we know that there's a need to understand this. So let's dive straight in. What are these dynamics of domestic violence we speak of? Often if you're working in the field of domestic violence, you have a complainant coming in, standing before you, giving the information of the incident, and as a frontline or a first responder, it becomes very day-to-day. Okay, here's the form you need to complete. Fill out this section, bring it back to me. I put it in a file, or I open a docket and it goes here, it goes there. It's very, very procedural. But what we don't often take into account is what has happened prior to that person coming in front of you. So I'm going to start at the very center of domestic violence. And here I'm presenting to you the wheel of power and control. Now, if you have worked in social work or attended a domestic violence training session or worked in the social sciences in the domestic violence field, you may have come across this wheel. Now, if we think about domestic violence at its core is a pattern of behaviors used by one person against another with the purpose of gaining or maintaining power and control. Now, this wheel really serves as a diagram to show what happens in between this need for power and control and the actual physical or sexual violence that you'll see on the outer side of this wheel. So inside of the wheel, you'll see the spokes, and these speak to the tactics that an abuser will use to keep the victims of their abuse under their power and control. These inside spokes of the wheel are made up of subtle, continual behaviors that happen over time. Abusive actions like those depicted in the outer ring, which are the ones of physical violence and sexual violence, are often reinforced with the use of these more subtle forms of violence. And when we talk about subtle forms of violence, we're talking about the use of something like emotional abuse. Often people will say there was a I don't know what you call it, but a saying when I was growing up of sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will never harm me. I think there's nothing further from the truth. If you think about emotional abuse, those are things that words are used to inflict that emotional abuse, making someone feel so small, putting them down, playing mind games with them, humiliating them in front of other people, using threats. You know, if you leave me, I'm going to harm myself. Or, or using intimidation to say, oh, you know, smashing a glass next to the person's head, and then using a threat to say, you see what happened to that glass, next time it's you. All those small things that are happening outside of that physical violence that we've come to assimilate to domestic violence. And it's important we understand this, because when somebody comes to seek services, they may be coming because they received a smack yesterday, but it's often underpinned by years of these smaller, and I say smaller because it's something that is not seen, but often it's those subtle acts that keep somebody under power and control. Now, as I said to you, this is something that happens over time, and it may at first feel like something really small, and it's like, oh, you know, that's just the way it is. He's a little bit jealous, but that's just him showing that he's loving me. I'm okay with that. And then it gets a little bit more serious. The next thing, you're being completely isolated from your support system, and that further entrenches this power and control, because your world becomes so small and you are now completely and utterly dependent on the person you fear the most. So when someone's standing in front of you and says, but I am fearful, it's all these smaller things that are adding to that. Now, in addition to the wheel of power and control, another well-known metaphor or diagram that is used to explain the domestic violence relationship is the cycle of violence and abuse. And there are many variations of the cycle, but the one that Mosaic uses is made up of these 5 stages: the build-up, explosion, remorse, pursuit, honeymoon, and so it continues. So what do we mean by these stages? Now, for anybody that has been in any form of relationship, I'm sure that we are aware of things that our partner or a family member or a good friend does that we're just like, oh, that doesn't sit right with me. And all of a sudden you're like, things feel a little bit tense. And you start feeling that there's going to be an argument that happens at some point. That's what we're talking about with this build-up phase. But imagine it being a little bit more intense, that it's something where you can feel the tension building, and as the recipient or the victim of violence, you try and do whatever you can to diffuse the situation. But during this build-up process, you could either be successful at diffusing it, or you're more than likely are not going to be able to diffuse it. And at this moment, the victim feels completely helpless. Now, the way that I like to also explain this is to use a pressure cooker as a metaphor. So looking at a pressure cooker, if you put liquid or something in a pressure cooker, you put the lid on, you turn it on, you can hear that pressure building up. And it builds and builds and builds and builds, and all of a sudden, the little knob on top hits the ceiling. And now that pot is filled with pressure. Now, if you try and remove the lid of that pot, the chances are it's going to explode. And this is exactly what happens in the cycle of violence and abuse. The pressure builds up, the tension builds up, and all of a sudden there's a violent outburst. Now, this violent outburst could happen days after the tension buildup, could happen hours after the tension buildup, it could be minutes. But it's a buildup and then this explosion. Now, the violent act could be a harsh words spoken, a massive argument where the perpetrator completely belittles and berates the other person. or it could be an act of physical violence, but it's a form of domestic violence that is very distinguishable. Build up and this massive thing happens. After that, the perpetrator will show remorse, but at the same time justify their outburst. So, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. But if you had just brought me my slippers when I got home, this wouldn't have happened. If you hadn't have made that rubbish food and actually made me the steak I wanted, I wouldn't have had to shout at you, or I wouldn't have had to hit you. And often at this stage, the perpetrator will also ask for forgiveness. If the victim still doesn't come across as having accepted that forgiveness or fully forgiven the perpetrator, they will pursue the victim. Now, this could be in acts of providing gifts or taking them to their favorite restaurants or buying them their favorite chocolate, anything to win back affection. Or they may even threaten to harm themselves, to say, oh, but I can't live without you. So if you can't love me, then I'm going to end my life. Any way to bring that person back in to their cycle, but remembering that wheel of power and control, anything to keep them there. And from there, whether it's full affection or part affection, if reconciliation occurs, they may experience this very intense, intimate relationship again. And this we call the honeymoon phase. When all of a sudden everyone's doing what everyone else wants them to do. There may be instances where, oh, let me run you a bath, or let me rub your back, and all of this intense intimacy starts until the next build up. And what happens in the cycle is when it starts, it may happen every other month. But as the relationship continues, so the cycle intensifies, so it speeds up, so it may happen 3 to 4 times a day. And as Professor Lillian Arts in her research once said, that while it appears to be a cycle, this can eventually turn up being a spiral. And why she says this is that the cycle time becomes shorter and shorter and shorter until this becomes the lived daily reality of both the perpetrator and the victim. So it's important that we understand this, because often when someone's standing in front of us, the question we'll often ask is, well, why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? Why do you accept what this person is doing to you? But if we understand that at an individual level, there is so many dynamics of power and control, we have a better sense of why it is not always easy to ask for help, to leave a situation. And we'll look at that a little bit more now. So like I said at the beginning, we were looking at 2 things in the session. We were looking at the dynamics of domestic violence. And I know that those things that we spoke about were quite, they seem to be quite limited to intimate partner relationships. But those cycles and the power and control wheel can apply to any relationship. So any domestic relationship it can apply to. Now we move a little bit broader than the individual. We're going to look a little bit at the socio-cultural factors that come into play and contribute to domestic violence and maintaining high levels of domestic violence. So what do we mean by socio-cultural factors? Well, these refer to the conditions within society that support, excuse, and in some way even encourage domestic violence. Now, these contributing factors happen at an individual level, an interpersonal or relationship level, a community level, and then at a broader societal level. Now, if we look at these 4 levels, when we talk about the individual, we're really talking about the person who's experiencing the violence, or individual beliefs or attitudes, or the person who's even using the violence. At an interpersonal level, we're talking about relationships. So these are mainly family relationships, or your more domestic relationships. We then get broader community, which would be your direct neighborhood and community, or spaces where you access services. So it could be education, work, that forms part of the broader community. And then at a societal level, that is where you see your national or provincial laws and policies, education systems, public health systems. That is all happening at a societal level. So what is happening at these levels that can contribute to maintaining domestic violence? Well, let's start at the outer ring, at society. Now, these are some social context and risk factors for domestic violence, and one of these are the existence of gender discriminatory laws. Now, in South Africa, we are incredibly lucky in that our laws are constitutional, and having one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, our laws are not gender discriminatory. But that doesn't stop other forms of discrimination and gender discrimination at a societal level. We are still seeing very high levels of gender inequality and discrimination at a societal level. We also live in a society that is incredibly violent, and increasingly so. And when violence happens at such high levels in society, it becomes very normalized. And as we will see as we go through, that then starts filtering into the different levels and becomes normalized at an individual level. If we see any form of political instability, whether that be a loss of confidence in political leaders, or infighting at a national political level, that can also contribute to a social context that drives domestic violence. And finally, macroeconomic factors. So when we hear things in the news around the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, things like that, it often seems quite far removed from us. But when those macroeconomic ties start influencing how money is spent on social security or social services, that could also have an impact on domestic violence and other forms of violence and social services at a societal level. Now, what about the community? Now, remember I said if we find other forms of discrimination and violence, it's going to start impacting on the other levels. And here we see it at a community level. Remember, society is quite large. We're looking at national policies, provincial policies, but community is closer to home. It's where do we live? Where do we work? Where do we go to school? That's where we're talking about community. And in community, it's often what shapes who we are and how we respond to the world. And here we find that where there are rigid gender norms, so gender norms that support gender inequality, also, they can also encourage the use of violence as a discipline term, that is a risk factor for domestic violence. The norms of family privacy, what happens in my house stays in my house. We don't discuss what happens in the family. We keep it hidden. We keep it private. We don't want to risk people thinking badly of our family. Where that is a norm, so is domestic violence. The norms of accepting violence against women and children, and this doesn't mean that it's only the acceptance of sexual offenses or other forms of violence against women and children, but even the acceptance of the use of corporal punishment in the home. That is seen as a norm of accepting violence against children. And where we see high levels of localized poverty and unemployment. Now, we know in a country like South Africa, we are seeing rising levels of unemployment. And this, again, is a risk factor for domestic violence. So what about at a relational level? So at the interpersonal level, the yellow circle there, where we see male dominance in decision-making, the saying, men as head of the households, the ultimate decision maker, where we see that happen, we also see increased levels of domestic violence. Again, here, now we've seen this thread of violence go from society through into the relationship. So where violence is seen as appropriate discipline, a risk factor for domestic violence. Where we don't communicate well in relationships, that often also leads to violence. And social isolation. Now, we're living in a world where we're increasingly isolating ourselves. We no longer know who our neighbor is. We don't know who the auntie is on the corner, where before it was common practice to know everyone who lived around you and almost formed part of each other's lives. That is becoming increasingly rare. And with that, when violence happens in the home, there's less people to reach out to, but also less people to know what is going on in your home. So let's finally look at the individual level, and where we find individual attitudes and behaviors that are that support gender inequality or are shaped by harmful gender norms. This will happen at an individual level, and that impacts or creates a risk of experiencing or perpetrating violence. Again, we talk about attitudes that accept violence, and then substance abuse. Now, this is something we are seeing that is ravaging through communities in South Africa. And substance use has a direct link to the use of violence, and especially the use of interpersonal violence within a domestic setting. Of course, it impacts on broader community violence and violence that we see, almost stranger violence, but none more so than what is happening within the domestic context. And that's spreads not only to intimate partner violence, but even what we're now seeing, such a massive increase in child on parent violence and violence against older persons for gaining access to resources for substance use. So the reason why we look at a social context in this way is we need to see how each level builds on another level. And if we consider South Africa and the situation that it is in right now, we need to also think about that we're seeing decreased access to disposable income. We're seeing increases in levels of poverty and unemployment. We're seeing macroeconomic factors come into play. We're seeing increasing use of violence within communities as either a form of community justice or just an increase in gangsterism and widespread use of violence as a form of controlling communities. Now, if we're seeing these as rising social context, then we have to see alarm bells going off and saying, yes, we were worried about COVID-19 and the impact that would have on domestic violence, but there are greater risk factors at play. And if we see these as risk factors for domestic violence, we also need to acknowledge that this may very well mean we're going to see a rise in domestic violence cases coming into the criminal justice system. I now want to move away a little bit about this broader picture, and I want to zone into the individual. Specifically, I want to zone into the individual who is a victim of domestic violence. Now, while the law makes provision for assistance through the criminal justice system, access to the system can be affected by a variety of factors. And one of these is when we look at the survival strategies of victims of domestic violence. Now, victims of domestic violence often suffer a range of abuses. Now, remember, we looked at that wheel of power and control, and we saw the number of abuses that, that victims experience. These abuses often compound in severity or frequency over time, and the relationship starts to disintegrate over this time as well. In 2008-2009, Mosaic, in partnership with Gender Health and Justice Research Unit again, conducted research that sought to identify the factors that contribute to domestic violence victims withdrawing from legal processes before they finalize their protection orders. So attrition research. And the research found that on average, domestic violence protection order applicants that were part of the study had been with their partners for 9 years, and they experienced abuse for at least half of that time before approaching the police or courts for assistance. Now, this is important to know because, firstly, police and courts are not always the first port of call. They would often draw on other resources. So these resources may be their friends, family, religious leaders, traditional leaders, other community-based organizations, and all the while experiencing increased severity of abuse. Now, when we look at victims of domestic violence and we say, well, why are you staying in a relationship? Often staying in that relationship is a survival strategy in and of itself for the victim of violence. Staying is often safer, and it's safer because at that moment, the victim of violence knows exactly what the pattern of abuse is. They are able to ascertain when they are at most danger, where the perpetrator is, how safe their children are, what their exit strategy is. And if they leave that relationship, they can see leaving as only a temporary means to stop the violence. But actually, they feel even more in danger because they don't know where the person is and what leaving has meant for that person's state of mind and their new use of violence. As I said to you, the going into the criminal justice system and the court processes, there are a number of factors that contribute to the withdrawal from the process. So in the same research that I spoke about, the findings provide an indication of the personal, social, and systemic context that may contribute to the reasons why victims of domestic violence find themselves unable to continue in the criminal justice system. Some of these include what was termed the Boomerang Effect. And here, domestic violence cases reported to the criminal justice system may be triggered by seemingly trivial events, but can quickly degenerate into violent episodes. Sometimes the very act of seeking a protection order results in a boomerang effect, whereby seeking help only amplifies threatening behaviors and escalates violence by the respondent. The incidence of violence that instigates legal action may sometimes also be seen as quite a minor incident. So they may come and report some controlling behavior, but from the victim's understanding of what they have experienced up to this point, they have an understanding that that small incident is actually going to lead to something a lot worse. So the incident itself may not be reflective, of the historical expressions of violence within the domestic relationship. And then going to court or the police to report a case of domestic violence is often a deadly decision in and of itself. Victims of domestic violence are often threatened with death or more violence if they initiate or proceed with criminal justice interventions, and so quickly approach the court to withdraw the case. The respondent or perpetrator may also use the threat of violence by others and threats to harm or kidnap the children. And finally, for this slide, systemic issues in actually finalizing the orders. The difficulties and complexities faced in navigating the application process becomes particularly glaring when considering the cases where applicants return to court to finalize the orders, but due to a systemic reason were unable to finalize their orders. So some of these systemic issues include poor criminal justice response, non-service of interim protection orders or notices, a lack of knowledge of the criminal justice system and its processes. And then on an individual case, there's often an individual, remember the cycle of violence? They may see the nature of violence change. So the nature of violence might change from physical violence to more emotional abuse. And the person might say, oh, I can handle this. It's not harming me. The kids can't see, the children can't see me being hit. So I'm okay now. I want to withdraw. There might be family intervention or pressure to withdraw from the family. And then we all know about the economic reasons and economic dependence on a partner in terms of domestic violence. And then just downright fear of the perpetrator is also another reason for attrition. So I mentioned a little bit about systemic barriers to accessing justice. And the slide, I know there's a lot of information on it, but as Deline mentioned, you will be receiving a copy of these slides. So I encourage you to take a look through some of these systemic barriers. When somebody approaches a court or a police station and they are received by, probably at a court, the first person they're going to see is a security guard who's going to ask them to announce to the world why they are approaching the court. And for the security guard, they're doing their job. They go, well, I need to know where to direct this person, and it's what I do every day. So, not really a problem. But for that person who has endured 4.5 years of violence before coming to the court and is already feeling so incredibly scared and fearful of what might happen to them, arrives at the court and now has to announce, I'm here, I'm looking for the domestic violence court. That in and of itself is a systemic barrier to accessing justice. But then when they actually get pulled into the system, they face administrative complexities. Protection orders are difficult to apply for if you don't understand legal terms. Sometimes you arrive at a court and there are 40 people waiting to be seen by the clerk, and you just may not make it today. The number of clerks dealing with high application demands are few. In some courts, there is one clerk, maybe two, that are dealing with high volumes of applications and are not able to provide a victim of violence with adequate time to listen to a story. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are administrative procedures to be followed. A clerk is not necessarily appointed to act as a social auxiliary worker or a counselor. And yet the person accessing that service has an understanding that they themselves may receive that service at the court. but also not understanding where someone is coming from when they arrive at the court and what they're experiencing in terms of domestic violence can lead to quite a cold reception for someone coming into that space. And when we look at harmful gender norms, these are not limited to just that social system that I showed you. When we think about clerks of the court, police members, magistrates, other functionaries now under the Amendment Act, the individuals that serve victims of violence come from the very same society that uphold these harmful gender norms. So we need to be doing more to sensitize these first responders on what it is that what service needs to be provided to victims of violence and in what way, and really start dismantling these harmful gender norms at a systemic level. And finally, we have an uncoordinated system. So we have courts doing one thing, police doing another, magistrates doing their thing, and now Department of Health doing theirs, Department of Social Development doing theirs. But at a very local level, where this implementation happens and where the victim lives, works, or studies, this uncoordinated system is a massive barrier to accessing justice in the way that the Amendment Act suggests that it is experienced. And to not address these very fundamental systemic barriers misses the point of the Domestic Violence Amendment Act. Completely. Because ultimately that act is there to ensure that access to justice is more easily attained. So if I may, just for another 5 minutes, for first responders that are on this platform and are wondering, well, that's all well and good. So now we understand the complexities, but what do we do when someone's actually standing in front of us? I thought I would take just a few moments just to share some of the pointers and tips that Mosaic has put together to guide the first responder in receiving a victim of domestic violence. One of the first things is to prepare for the consultation. Now, in our courts, police stations, there isn't always a private space to be able to speak to someone. But what we propose is that you are mindful of the fact that here is someone who is traumatized, has experienced years of abuse, and does not want to announce to the world what is happening to them. So be mindful of this. Speak in a soft voice. Try and find a corner somewhere that you're able to speak to someone, or position an office in a way that you don't have two complainants sitting next to each other and can hear each other's stories. Also, understand what services you can provide. Don't set up unrealistic expectations for the complainants. And keep up to date with the changes and amendments that are happening around you, especially now with the Amendment Acts coming into being. What does it say? What is your new role? What is it that you need to provide the complainant with? During the consultation, it is very important to let the complainant know if you have an obligation to report. As functionaries, there is now new obligations to report under the Domestic Violence Amendment Act. What does that look like? Have you disclosed to the complainants that you need to report a case of violence against an older person? And they may at first go, oh, I don't know if I want to tell you this now, but rather protect yourself as well as the complainant and provide them with the option to decide whether to speak to you and share what they want to share with you. When asking questions, don't cross-examine or pass judgment. So when someone comes in and you go, well, why were you there at 2 o'clock in the morning? You may really want to know what led that person to leave their house at 2 o'clock. But to the victim, they're experiencing this as victim blaming, and they feel that they are being judged for something that happened to them and not something that they brought on themselves. Take time to listen to the complainant's story. And as they retell their story, identify acts of domestic violence. Many times, the complainant will only see the act of physical violence as domestic violence. And when they're compiling their affidavit, they don't put all those nuances and subtle forms of domestic violence into their affidavit. So listen to their story, ask clarifying questions to try and assist them to put forward their full story or their full experience to the magistrate who needs to make the decision. And then don't ask questions that shift blame to the victim. So victim blaming, like I mentioned, is to blame the victim for someone else's actions. For a domestic violence victim being told that they are responsible for the acts of domestic violence perpetrated against them. Well, why did one of the things they might say is, well, what did you do to antagonize him? That's telling the person they asked for the violence or they did something to bring it on themselves. So after the consultation, provide your mandated services and refer for additional and/or follow-up services. And when doing that, make sure that it's a relevant referral and that the place you're referring the person to actually exists. Often we have people come to us and go, but I was referred to you for maintenance services, for instance, and Mosaic doesn't do maintenance services. So it's making sure that you have a referral pathway defined, that you know where the person can be referred to get services. And the age-old question, what to do with the return complainant? This is something that has been asked and really links back to the withdrawals. Understanding the dynamics of domestic violence and understanding the survival techniques put in place. It will not be unusual for a complainant to return for a follow-up service or for the exact same service. As the first responder, as frustrating as it might be, we can't pass judgment. We also can't refuse to assist that person. But what we do need to do is to assure them that domestic violence is never okay. Even if they withdrew it, they were coming sheepishly back to you. Make sure they know it's not okay and that you're there to assist. And try your best to be patient and and listen to the complainant as they share their current experience. And please, Mosaic has been doing this work for a very long time. And we are fully aware of withdrawals and the need to work with return complainants. But try and understand what underpins this. Try and understand the very nature and dynamics of domestic violence really impacts how a person shows up in the world, how they seek services, and how they try to stay safe. So just a parting word from my side. As long as I have been in the gender-based violence sector, which is just over a decade always sounds so much better than 10 years, I have heard the phrase that in South Africa, we have fantastic pieces of legislation, and the problem is in the implementation. We cannot continue to accept this as the newfound South African proverb. Legislation can only do so much. Yes, it provides the scope and provisions for the law to be applied, but ultimately the implementation of the law takes place at a local community level. It takes place and is implemented by individuals. And it's so imperative for those individuals to understand that the person standing in front of you is not trying to make your life difficult. They're really there, putting their best foot forward to try and ensure their safety and the safety of their children. And with that in mind, I want to encourage you to, after the session, go through these slides again and think about your own role within the criminal justice system, or if you're a civil society organization, think about the person that stands in front of you and the service that you provide, and ask yourselves, do I truly understand the dynamics of domestic violence and what this person is facing right then and there as they stand in front of me, rather than thinking of which form do I need to fill out right now. With that, I want to thank you. I'm really looking forward to the discussion component of the session, and I hand over to Deline to open for questions and answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. That's just such an invaluable contribution to the discussion. Thank you for reminding us that we need to be mindful of the social context and also to approach a holistic, have a holistic approach. Basically, I think what I've really taken from your presentation is really to put the person before the procedure. And thank you so much once again for just sketching the background to the social-cultural factors, reminding us that we really are living in a very violent society and we're part of that culture, and we really need to have a whole of society approach, ensure that our pathway of services are clear, and we are seeing only the tip of the iceberg when the person approaches us for assistance, and that we need to have a bigger understanding of what has brought them to that point, or to that tipping point. So thank you so much once again. I'm going to ask people to please put your hands up to pose questions or to post them in the chat box. Please do make use of this opportunity to engage with Karen. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm seeing a lot of praise and gratitude for your presentation, Karen. I'm not seeing very many questions yet. I'm not sure if anyone would like to just weigh in on some of that which Karen has shared, the fantastic tips that she shared with us as well. I think it's just been made very, very practical, which is most useful. I see there is one hand up from Mr. or Miss Magidela. Please do go ahead and unmute yourself and pose your question, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name has already been mentioned as being Prudence Magidela. By profession, I'm a magistrate based in the Northern Cape, most rural part of the Northern Cape, that is. My question, firstly, before I go into the crux of what I want to put out, is whether you deal with all stakeholders in relation to domestic violence or not? Or do you only consult them when you are doing research for the purposes such as presentations like the one you have just offered? Then upon response on that, then I'll be able to put out what I'd like to put out from what I got here.
Sure. Prudence, thank you so much for your question. As Mosaic, we have been working within the field of domestic violence for the last, what did I work out today, 29 years. So the work that we do is very consultative, and we try actually to work at quite a local level. So while we contribute to the national discussion and law reform at a national level, we actually focus our work on trying to coordinate services at a very local level, and we work together with all stakeholders. So the criminal justice sector, but also working with the broader social service sector and community-based organizations, in order to, and as well as religious and traditional leaders, to try and build a coordinated and collaborative response to domestic violence at a community level. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, it basically does, but I do not want to follow up on a question on that, but rather put out what you've touched on in your presentation, especially when you referred to the criminal justice system. Now, the criminal justice system comprises of different stakeholders, as you are aware. And in most instances of domestic violence related matters, the first responder would normally be SAPS. Now, the problem in SAPS, or the problem in the criminal justice system, is that that system in itself is a reactive rather than proactive system. Now, what I want to establish is, do you have a means, because now I am considering a means to actually look at things that fix the problem that we're trying to address here, than things that respond to the problem or even amplify the problem that is domestic violence. Because the challenges with SAPS to begin with is that in most instances you will find that the matters are attended to by people who are not even sensitive to the nature of the matter, whereby the nature of such instances are not instances that you can just be dealing with in an ordinary community service center, that's being a charge office. You touched on that there is supposed to be a secluded room or a secluded consultation center to deal with such. And that is what basically affects the criminal justice system from the onset, because the manner in which the application has been dealt with or done, or the manner in which the complaint has been attended to, is basically going to have a bearing on how the whole process goes forth. Now, do you, for instance, look into that, or do you have a system that addresses that? Because what I've observed from South Africa in general is that new proverb that you referred to, of having beautiful pieces of legislation, but in practice such are not in. Now that is how can I say, it's what is becoming the norm in the system, so much so that preference is given to anything but the complainant, to anything but the problem that should be addressed. And then you will find that I'll make an example, for instance, by referring to accountants, auditors, magistrates. When those people are appointed, or when consideration is given for them to be appointed, you'd be asked to declare your assets, you'd be asked to declare your financial state, because a determination has to be made whether it would be best suited to appoint you to deal with the work that you are being appointed for. Now, biggest question is that looked into when it comes to people who need to work with domestic violence victims? I would guarantee you that the answer would be no. And then you will find instances such as another practical example again, the investigation that ended up on the lap of the public protector, Alticia and Renisha Korke. You remember the lady from Cape Town who was from Belleville, who had apparently been killed after being turned away from the court. Mm-hmm. But the report, or the report of the public protector, was to the effect that she must have lost her patience whilst waiting there, because they had waited to serve her, but when the time to be served arrived, she had gone already. Now that again speaks, you have this legislation that can be of assistance to that person, but you don't have the resources because a victim should not lose patience. And why do victims lose patience? They lose patience because they do not get the help that they need. They get the help that has been put in place for them. And not everything that has been put in place is something that's helpful to you. So what I'm basically trying to establish is, do we even have a system to deal with domestic violence, a realistic approach system, and not a system that is there to boast that we have this and this and this and this to address domestic violence, yet we do not have something to address domestic violence, because what is there on paper to address domestic violence and what is there in practice to address it is not the same thing. It basically amounts, according to me, to the same thing as our constitution is being dubbed at. We adopted a constitution that has been modeled from constitutions of well-developed countries, one leading country being Canada. But does South Africa have the resources? Is South Africa a country to live with a constitution like the one we have? And I believe everyone else can answer that question on practical matters that face us on a daily basis. And then the last question, because I believe you're going to be able to respond to these in unison. The last issue is then, is anything really in place when it comes to domestic violence vis-a-vis our economic stature? I am asking this on the basis of majority of female victims. Unfortunately, the reality is one that points to female victims. Majority of female victims stay in domestic relationships, domestic violence relationship or marriages, grow accustomed to such relationships because of their economic status. Many of them are even forced in a way by the very system that is supposed to assist them. Hence my previous question, that is meant to assist them, they stay in domestic abuse relationships because economically they do not have an alternative. Otherwise, I do not believe that anyone would be prepared to die at the hands of their partner if their economic stature enabled them to stand alone. And also the social fiber. Is our, or are we considering the economic stature in line with our social development or social economic developments to say that the systems we introduced as being a solution are sustainable under such economic circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prudence. I think you have raised some fundamental points and things that we have been speaking about for many years now around, if we're looking at a system that is put in place to respond to domestic violence, how is the system actually responding? And the one of the things that we hoped to do through the research was to take a slightly different approach. I think everyone in this room has a good sense that the system put in place to respond to domestic violence is one that looks great on paper, but is not being experienced in the way that the legislation regulates it to be implemented. So the research that we did really looked at the perceptions of individuals. So how did an individual clerk or an individual magistrate or an individual SAPS member, how did they understand or perceive domestic violence? How did they perceive their role? How did they perceive the role of others? For us to get a sense that at a very local level, how was all of this coming together? And that's where we found that there were quite large inconsistencies in how it was understood that implementation was supposed to happen. And so I think that's one thing, is to say we are dealing with individuals, and a 2-week block or a day block of, or a 5-day block of training on domestic violence is not sufficient to fully understand the complexities. It's not sufficient to inform years of practice in a role. So for us, it's very much about, we need to be focusing more on the individual development of first responders that are there. And we actually include clerks of the court also as first responders when we look at first responders in addition to police members. And we need to start working on individual developments to fully appreciate the person that's standing in front of you when they come as a complainant. But I think you speak to deeper structural issues and systemic issues when you're talking about this response system that we have. And I didn't quite catch, I wanted to note down the one thing that you said was not everything put into place is necessarily there to help the person at that time, but rather it gets put in place. The person has to deal with whatever is put in place at the court or at the police station that they access. And that's the very thing we're dealing with here. So Mosaic doesn't have the answer on how to fix that. I think we can say we need more resources. I think we can say that there's limited training. I think we can say that there is, that there needs to be more feet on the ground. But at the end of the day, I think it comes down to who's holding who accountable for what is being done, and how are systems working together? Where are the intersections? Where are the overlaps? Are we just repeating the silos at national level, at local level? If we are, we can't expect a system to be integrated and provide a holistic response. So we really need to start working differently. And if we just continue to throw money at a broken system, it's not going to fix the system. We need to be very clear on what we're putting in place to fix that. Then the economic dependency that you spoke about, it is a huge challenge that we have, and one that we're experiencing at a national level, and actually you're seeing it at an international level as well, as economies slip further and further into recession. What does this mean? And when you, as part of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, it's made up of 6 pillars. And the 5th pillar actually speaks to the economic empowerment of women. And that is the core focus of trying to deconstruct or to address the structural drivers of gender-based violence and femicide, with a large focus on economic empowerment. So what that looks like, I'm not in a position to say, but it is something that's on the radar within the National Strategic Plan. But I think it's something we need to start looking at a lot more intensely if we're wanting to really shift inequality in earnings within the country, but keeping in mind that it's on the backdrop of a declining economy, a fiscus that's in huge trouble, and a global economy that is slipping into recession. So what that means, and again, is it something that can be addressed on a more local level rather than a macro level? Do we need to start investing in local economies to make that grow, and rather than looking at massive corporations and monopolies? So these are just thoughts I'm putting out there. I haven't done much research into economic empowerment and women's role, but I agree with you. I think it's something that we need to be looking at more seriously. And looking at it across the country, and looking at companies that are based outside of the country that are extracting profits. What are they doing to include women in that profit share and economic development?
Well, thank you so much for that, Karen. And thank you for really getting us thinking, Ms. Magadela. I think that I could just perhaps add from my side is the whole intention, and one of the reasons why the domestic violence amendments have not been implemented yet is that one's really looking at training, looking at drilling down in terms of the directives. And because what we're trying to do is to ensure that we have a clear pathway of services. The police are not the social workers. That's why the functionaries have been introduced so that we have different doors of entry when you're accessing services. And hopefully with that, one will then move towards a more responsive system. Karen, we only have about 5 minutes left before the webinar is over. So I'm going to just shift us over to the chat again, and there's a number of compliments once again, but there is a just a question or a statement, and then I'll just slip over to the questions. And the one is that how can we do away with the systemic barriers of victims having to carry home hard copies of interim orders and final protection orders? And then the second question, if I could just put them together for you, is what should an abused first responder or functionary do to curb secondary victimization when attending to a victim of domestic violence? So I'm going to hand those over to you, and that gives us about 3 minutes before we need to close the webinar. Thank you so much.
Sure, and thank you so much for your questions. The first one around hard copies, I mean, this is one of the things that as civil society we've been calling for the longest time, to be able to not rely on paper-based copies. We know what happens with paper-based copies. They very quickly get lost, destroyed. When you have to flee a house, your protection order gets left behind, or the respondent just tears it up in and of itself. The Domestic Violence Amendment Act has made provision for an electronic repository, and that will be for the storage of specific documents, including copies of protection orders and interim orders. What we are hoping, and we will see this in the final regulations, is that these copies would actually be made available to the complainant in electronic form, because service can be made electronically in certain instances. So hoping that that will be an option, so that they don't need to carry hard copies. The question around the abused person, so if I'm understanding it correctly, the question is what happens when the first responder themselves are experiencing abuse, or are a victim of domestic violence themselves, but they are now serving victims of domestic violence. I hope I'm understanding that correctly. In that instance, I would really encourage first responders to make use of their employee assistance programs. Now, I know there's huge resistance within SAPS for SAPS members to use the employee assistance program, but it does exist, and I really encourage people to make use of that. I know within the Department of Justice, there's also an employee assistance and development program. I might have got the terminology wrong, but it is available. So please seek that assistance. Even if you aren't wanting to disclose your own experience of violence, at least be able to have someone that you can speak to confidentially that is able to help you to process what you are currently experiencing. And if you find that you are not able to provide that person with the support that they need, then approach your superiors and see if you're able to serve in another area. The great thing about the courts is that there are multiple courts that you are able to be a clerk in. There are a number of different areas that you can serve in the police, but rather do that than subject someone else to secondary victimization. So I'm hoping I answered that question. If it is somebody who's asking, what do I do if I'm experiencing abuse by the person I'm trying to assist? I'm hoping that understanding the dynamics of violence will enable a first responder to be able to see that any abuse that is hurled towards them is actually not aimed at the person as an individual, and that it's rather something that is being underpinned by the complainant's experience of years of controlling behavior and violence.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for that. I'm just going to ask if we could sneak in one question. I know that Ms. Magadela is hands up, but I'm going to ask for Delia Bernardi to come in because she hasn't had a chance yet. If you still have a question, Delia, please do come in just on the hour so that we can, before we close the webinar.
Thank you, Deline. Yes, I just wanted to highlight the severity of intimate partner violence, which often culminates in femicide or mariticide, that the Lenora Walker cycle of violence is not always descriptive of the battering incident. Many batterers or perpetrators are typically remorseful and vow never to abuse their partners again, but a substantial body of evidence suggests that antisocial traits are a major risk factor for both sexes' involvement in partner abuse, where there's absolutely no remorse and no conscience.
Yeah, thank you so much for that contribution, Delia. And I think we trivialize the idea of remorse, but sometimes that remorse can be done in also very subtle ways. So I agree. I think there are antisocial behaviors that are displayed within relationships, and often it starts off in such a subtle way that it becomes so normalized within the relationship that it's not even identifiable by the person that is stuck within that cycle. And I think that's something for us to also think about as we think of that wheel of power and control, even that someone from the outside can see things clear as day, but for the person in that cycle, it often is so normal and such a integral part of the relationship that it's not even seen as a risk factor to them. So thank you for raising that, Delia.
Well, thank you. That slips us over just past the half hour, and I'd like to just thank Ms. Magadela also for just popping her little last note into the chat box, referring us to the S versus Lindani Nakani matter. And I'm sure we will all get a chance to have a look at that. The 2017 Western Cape High Court judgment, which I'm sure will be quite instructive. And I really thank you for the passionate way in which you've actually presented your questions. And thank you once again, Karen, for just encapsulating it so well. I think that now that we've started the conversation, I'm sure we could go on for quite a while, but we need to wrap up. So I want to thank all the organizers for the webinar, thank Karen for her preparation and time, and thank you all for engaging and being part of this webinar. Your attendance is really appreciated. And Lindani will be sending out the presentation, and please do keep an eye out for our next webinars. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.